Hello, everyone. You just heard the song We Just Won't Be Defeated by the Go Team, which is a strong example of a music genre we're about to identify called cheerleader rock. Cheerleader rock incorporates cheerleader chants, blaring electric guitars, and marching band instrumentals. The two standout acts of this style are the Go Team and Sleigh Bells, but we are also going to discuss some tracks by Toni Basil, Gwen Stefani, and Junior Varsity. Joseph is skiing in Colorado this week, so I'm joined by our friend Christine to discuss the topic.
Hey, Nathan. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, and Christine, you're C-Money on the Discord.
I am, yes.
Okay, cool. So what exactly is cheerleader rock? As mentioned, it's a genre, but this is a new term we're coining to describe something that's existed since at least 2004 with the Go Team's first album, Thunder Lightning Strike. But there are several musicians that we think can fall under this umbrella.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's interesting is that the Go Team and Sleigh Bells are both kind of that like mid to late 2000s / into the early 2010s vibe, but we can kind of trace back just ever so slightly earlier a couple other artists, like Nathan mentioned, that potentially were influences.
Yeah. And cheerleader and varsity aesthetics are lightly referenced by largely all of the groups we're about to discuss, but there isn't really a cohesive aesthetic to go along with cheerleader rock. At the end, we're going to talk about cheerleader fashion just for the fun of it. But typically, there's just like a handful of gestures to football, varsity athletics, and then like cheerleading, but they're really here and there. They're not all the time. And so how has it been that this subgenre has been out there for this long without anyone writing a think piece or doing a podcast episode on it to identify it? I think this is a good case study of what happens when someone doesn't come around to coin a term to describe a genre or an aesthetic or a subculture. Because typically, as Joseph and I have noticed and commented on in other episodes about topics like this, when that happens, it usually marks their decline. And as we're about to go into, the Go Team and Sleigh Bells, they've had really long, very healthy careers, in part because I think this never happened.
Yeah, and one thing I noticed when reading interviews, both from 20 years ago and then as recent as this year with both the Go Team and Sleigh Bells, a recurring theme that I noticed is that they mentioned how critics and scenes were always trying to put a label and genre onto them, and nothing ever quite fit. And I think it's because both artists were doing something so unique and kind of different at the time that I don't think we had really a way to like quite quantify it the way that you just did with cheerleader rock. It seems like with Sleigh Bells, people were trying to say, were they metal with rap? And with the Go Team, it was always a mix of, are they electronic? Are they indie? Are they for kids? And I think it just was so fresh that people didn't quite have the resources to name what they were doing when they came out.
Yeah, because this was much earlier in the internet. This was before like K-Hole, Nymphet Alumni, Silent Generation. Maybe Hipster Runoff, if they had figured this out, they could have noticed the trend and coined a term for it. But there weren't as many people trying to spot trends as there are now.
Oh, yeah. And I think about it at the time, you were really getting your understanding of music from resources like Pitchfork, Pace Magazine, or maybe like somebody's individual blog, but there wasn't as much of a reach. And I think your point about predicting trends, I don't think that those music blogs were really trying to do that. I think they were more so just kind of like the traditional music magazines of reviewing artists, criticizing them, giving them ratings, but they weren't really trying to seek something out or name it.
Yeah, and I think part of why maybe no one noticed that all of these things could be connected is because they were all, again, largely divorced from that like cheerleader aesthetic. It made it harder for them to identify it.
Definitely.
So now we can get into a survey of cheerleader rock music. The first person we're going to talk about is Toni Basil, and she's known for her signature song, Mickey. So Mickey, it reached number 1 on the US Billboard Hot 100 for 1 week in 1982. So this is the earliest song. We'll play it now. So this song It starts out with a like 30-second or so cheerleader chant that sounds like pretty much what you'd hear in a high school stadium, except it's about a hot guy. It's not something you'd actually hear cheerleaders talk about unless they were deranged, but it really just sounds like a one-to-one translation. And then the rest of the song, it's actually largely just 80s new wave.
Yeah, exactly. It's funny because when you think of Cheerleader, I think most people think of Hey Mickey as a song, just with the iconic beat and the music video. And I think what's interesting to note is that MTV had just debuted. And so the idea of a music video was still like super fresh, super important. And so even though it's simplistic with just having Toni Basil in her cheerleading uniform and dancing with cheerleaders, I think it really was just an image that stuck with people. And just if you aren't familiar, she's had a really successful career as a choreographer. I think her other video that's super well known is the Talking Heads Once in a Lifetime, where David Byrne plays the preacher-ish kind of character. That was all choreographed by her. But yeah, just in general, it's interesting thinking about how she even went with the choice of the cheerleader outfit. It wasn't originally, I think, something that was curated by like a record label or anything.
Yeah.
I was reading that it was her actual uniform that she wore in high school, and she just showed up to set and then made the video.
Yeah. She looks really good in it, though.
And she's
Uh,
in her 30s too, which is crazy.
okay, I was actually kind of about to say that she does not look like a cheerleader exactly. It does look a little bit off. But yeah, it is a really iconic music video.
Yeah, and I think just as a song, it's I've definitely been like parodied or re-sampled. I know we'll talk about it later potentially, but the movie Bring It On has a little homage to Hey Mickey at the end. I'm sure there's other examples I
Yeah.
can think of.
You know what I thought as a kid? I thought that she was saying Vicky for some reason, and I thought she was basically exclaiming her name. She was like, "Hey, I'm Vicky." But no, that's not what the lyrics are about. And the lyrics actually, they sometimes read a little bit too far into them. They think it's about something that I don't want to repeat on air. But if you want to go and search for that, you can find it.
I feel like there's always conspiracy theories about like songs trying to make them something R-rated. I sort of remember hearing that, but I don't think that's true.
Yeah, she said in interviews that it's not. She was like, "What are you talking about?"
People, man. I didn't know this, but it's actually a cover. It comes from a 1979 version of the song from a band called Racy, who I've never heard of, but apparently she took it and she added the whole "Hey Mickey, you're so fine, you blow my mind" line to the song, which I think is kind of one of the more iconic parts of the song.
Yeah. And then the next group we can talk about is the Go Team. So, do you want to talk a little bit about their background?
Yeah, sure. So the Go Team began as a solo project conceived by Ian Parton. He was a documentary film director. So, taking that inspiration of making documentaries, he wanted to incorporate music elements with blaring guitars from inspirations of bands like Sonic Youth and My Bloody Valentine, but also with double Dutch chants, Bollywood soundtracks, old school hip hop, and electronic music, as well as just even TV adverts and Sesame Street, really creating this unique cohesive sound. And so their first album was released in 2004, and that's called Thunder, Lightning, Strike.
Yeah, and their sound, it's much more lo-fi than the other groups we're going to talk about. Their approach to cheerleader rock, it's both aesthetically and musically coming at this angle that's very like 70s and 80s. And I think the blurring between the two was very popular in the mid 2000s. Like we were talking before we started recording about, we were watching this like live performance they did with Jimmy Kimmel where they were wearing these outfits that were these particular shades of red and blue that just read as very like Urban Outfitters.
Yeah, and what I find really interesting about the music and the use of lots of samples is that I think traditionally using samples in music at the time would have been either in like electronic music or hip hop. I'm sure there were some indie bands that maybe would repurpose like a guitar riff, but there wasn't the direct use of samples the way that the Go Team really like repurposes them. And interestingly enough, when he first made the album, he didn't think he was going to reach any fame or success, so he didn't clear any of the samples. But once the album began to rise in popularity, he had to work with a musicologist to find basically other samples that would come close that could replace the ones that they couldn't get cleared.
Yeah. No, I read about that, how there's like a quote unquote legal and illegal version of Thunder Lightning Strike, and the song links are a little different. And the official release, which is the legal version you can now buy, that one had 2 extra songs on it, including Hold Your Terror Close, which is one of my favorite songs from the album. But yeah, I think like back in the day with the early internet, people were able to access music for the first time in this way that they couldn't before. And people would be like, oh, listen to this Ethiopian jazz, or listen to this 1960s music from Cambodia. So I think maybe Ian Patton was like of that strain where he was just getting really hyped for this like obscure music he could suddenly access. Although I do know that some of the music he found it in record stores, and that was where he found the music he sampled.
No, I think you bring up a good point. Like, even though it was still, a lot of work to download music as somebody who did it back in 2004 when I was a kid, it was still much more accessible than what you had previously, where you could only have physical, copies of whatever you wanted to utilize. And so I think you're completely on the money that it opened up a new world and kind of new way of thinking about music. Different topic for a different day, but I think that was around the period where the idea of like mashups started to really like form and become
Yeah.
popular. And I think it's precisely for that reason.
Yeah. And so who are the members of the Go team? Because the Go team, when it first started, it had 6 members. 3 members are still part of the band. The 3 that left, they left after the 3rd album, Rolling Blackouts, got released in 2011. But low-key, the whole time, the band has sort of been the vision of the first member, Ian Patton, because he started working on it around the year 2000, and he released it before he met Ninja, before he met Sam Duke and all of the others. He sought out people who he thought could perform the music that he had assembled through all of the samples and then all of these recordings he made of himself playing the instruments.
Yeah, next, I would love to point out probably the most iconic member of the band outside of Ian, the lead vocalist, Ninja. She's a wonderful performer. If you ever see her live, she's doing kick flips. She's high energy. She's getting the audience hype. And what's interesting is I think you noted when we were reviewing notes for this, how she describes herself as a vocalist rather than a singer, because she feels as though she doesn't do as much singing, but more chanting and rapping.
I mean, she does so much for the band. Like, we actually got to see the Go team live in October, which we're going to get to later. But like watching her perform, like she's singing while doing high kicks. And then also where I learned that she calls herself a vocalist, it was this documentary of the Go team in 2011. She also mentioned how she like gets a ton of bruises just from performing because she's like dancing and people accidentally hit her with guitars. But yeah, in the years since, newer members have been added to fill in the role of band members who were previously replaced. But from what I glean from the internet, it seems like Ian Patton hasn't wanted these new members to play as much of a collaborative role, or the old ones for that matter. Again, it's largely his vision and his project from what I gather.
Yeah, I think I've gathered that as well. He's sort of the creative mastermind behind it, whereas Ninja kind of comes out as just the performer. And it's interesting because it makes me think of like the director versus actor. They're both 2 really important and crucial roles, but they serve different functions. And you could say like Ninja would be the quote unquote actor, the singer, the lead woman, but Ian's the director, the mastermind, the producer behind it all.
Yeah. Another thing about the members of the Go team is that they can perform like an absurd number of instruments. And like individual members like Ian Patton, he can play things like guitars, harmonicas, pianos, drums, triangles, and more. It's a hard sound to replicate because there are so many marching band instrumentals that go into the sound of the Go team.
Yeah, I think at one point I saw them with a kazoo. But I think that's what makes their sound also so unique and fresh, is that it breaks away from just the guitar, bass, drums like most rock and roll bands were doing at the time. And having all of those different instruments, I think that makes it harder to say, oh, they sound like this band or oh, they sound like that band, because I can't really think of too many other bands that were using that many instruments besides maybe Broken Social Scene, but they have a completely different sound. So that's really the only similarity I think they share with the Go team.
I do feel like there was an era, though, in indie music where, for whatever reason, it was really popular to have bands with like 10 or more people. Like, have you ever seen the video of the Edward Sharpe and the Magnetic Zeros at the Tiny Desk concert? And there's like 11 of them behind the Tiny Desk.
Oh, yes. And funny enough, I've seen Edward Sharpe and the Magnetic Zeros live in 2010. So it definitely was that era. Like Polyphonic Spree also comes to mind. And Los Campesinos is another multi-unit band. And I think sometimes the Go team unfairly gets associated with that genre. But the bands we just mentioned, I kind of view them more in the trope of millennial stomp clap
Like
music.
Civil War wave. That was a
Yes.
hipster runoff term.
Yes, Civil War. Yes, exactly. It's that like, we're not gonna die, and you'd hear it at like a coffee shop in Denver or something, or I guess it'd be a brewery more likely. But I don't think the Go team again has any real association besides just having lots of members.
Yeah, those bands, like the ones you just talked about too, they tend to have more male vocals. The Go Team and Cheerleader rock, largely it's female vocals. It's a very uh, because it's such like an upbeat genre.
Yeah, exactly. And what was interesting was I was reading an interview with Ian Patton that kind of highlights on what you just mentioned, where he intentionally wanted to include more female artists within his band. I'll read the quote now where he says, I was always frustrated by the way indie music would always stay within its world. It was four blokes with guitars, and I was trying to get anti that, mix up girls and boys, and confusing the indie kids, basically annoy them.
Yeah. I saw another video where he was doing an interview where he said something about where he's quoting someone else, but the most important thing a band should do, or the first thing, is take a picture. He was thinking about the aesthetic first of the look of the band. And honestly, it did appeal to me because it has this like mixed gender split. There's a black female vocalist. When the band first started, there were two other women that were the primary vocalists, and it just appealed to me, I think, more than just seeing a bunch of guys on stage.
Yeah, and I think, what's interesting with rock, and there's always been kind of the interplay of aesthetics versus the sound, right? And I'm thinking of like the Gen X attitude that was prevalent, a decade before the Go team would have released music was aesthetics don't matter. You're a sellout if you care too much about it. I think as a reaction to 80s hair metal, let's say. But I think the Go team really shows the importance of when you marry the aesthetics with the sound, it creates a really rich experience that you can see both visually and sonically. And I think that with the Go team, and especially even their music videos, it amplifies what the music's getting at.
Yeah, because that was actually how I first discovered the Go Team. Because the first The Go Team song I ever heard was on Cartoon Network. It was Milk Crisis, which I'll play now. So Milk Crisis, it had this like really nice music video with a bunch of pixelated animals and plants. And it felt like it was designed for children because it was. I wouldn't be surprised if the music video was paid in part by Cartoon Network. But it really captured my attention. And it was at the age where like I was first interested in exploring music on my own. Like I knew I didn't like the music of my parents. I didn't want to listen to that. But the Go Team and other music I discovered through Cartoon Network, like Lady Sovereign, that was my first exposure to like music I wanted to listen to on my own.
Yeah, I wish I remembered where I discovered the Go team, but watching that clip, it would have absolutely hooked me in as a kid as well. And I think the aesthetics and the music both have everything to do with that. I was also looking just at other Cartoon Network videos at that time, and I don't know if you remember the band The Hives, but they also had another one, but, it's not as good as the Go Team.
Yeah, I don't remember that one. And then I think their most famous song of all time is Huddle Formation. That has the most listens on Spotify, so I'll play that one now. And so Huddle Formation, I think like most of the Go Team's music, it has a very lo-fi feel to it, like it was made in a garage in the 70s or 80s instead of the mid-2000s. The only other musical act I think on this list that tries to make Cheerleader rock sound old is Junior Varsity, which we're going to get to in the end. But I think, as we're going to get to, it's pretty safe to say that they're taking a lot of inspiration from the Go Team with their newer music.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that, and listening to Huddle Formation, it feels both timeless and retro at the same time, and I think that gives it a timeless quality. I can hear this song in my mind now because it starts with 5, 6, 5, and, like, I don't and then, like, just hearing the beat come in, like, there's something about it that just instantly, like, lifts my mood and transports me back to being 15, 14 when I first started listening to the Go Team. And just on a personal note, I think what is interesting or why this band matters to me a lot is when you're, in middle school, early high school, I think there's often a tendency to listen to kind of more angsty music to get your teenage feelings out, which I definitely participated in. But I think it was really nice to have the Go Team there as an example of the other side of just joyous and uplifting. And I think my middle school self needed that. And like as I've mentioned before, there just wasn't really anything else sounding like that there at the time.
Yeah, and I feel like it is a good celebration of youth. Like even their second album, the name is Proof of Youth.
Yeah, I think what's interesting reading about their influences is how they take a lot of influence on girl groups from the 60s, which were often, young teenagers and women in their early 20s, and then cartoons from the 70s, 80s, and Sesame Street. And I think when we think of cheerleaders, we think of youth, right? Like most cheerleaders are in high school or younger. And there's something about the element of youth that I think is really pervasive in cheerleader rock that all of the bands we're going to discuss today,
Yeah, because all
capture.
of these things can synthesize really seamlessly. And I think, many people on the list, they arrived at this idea without referencing anything older. The only one who seems to have done that. Well, Sleigh Bells did that with Gwen Stefani, as we'll get to, but also Junior Varsity with the Go Team. But it's really easy to synthesize rock music with the idea of varsity sports and then cheerleaders because they're all references to Americana. And they all seem to be like hitting at the same thing, which is this like timelessness and this like celebration of youth.
And what's also important too is that while it hits all those elements, Ian's very deliberate about saying he didn't try to make this record or any of his records be retro or ironic. Like he really wanted it to come across as being sincere. And so even though it incorporated these elements of, 60s, 70s, 80s, it wasn't meant to be some sort of like shiny advertisement of a time. He was trying to say, I'm taking the best bits of all of these different eras and genres and make something fun and rewarding.
And it is fun, as we experienced at their show at Lincoln Hall. So this October, the Go Team was touring the US to play Thunder Lightning Strike after 20 years because it was the 20th anniversary of that album. So they did the concert where they played all the songs off that album and then they played a few more songs off of many of their other albums because I think they've come out with 7. But yeah, I'm really glad I got the chance to see them because they've been going for 20 years. They could have very easily broken up and I would have never had the opportunity to hear this band that had been so important to me when I was younger. And then also it's only $23.
I know, right?
That was so good.
I know. Shout out to Lincoln Hall lately. They've been affordable with their concerts.
Yeah.
um, So that certainly helped. I'm with you. The Go Team for a long time was actually one of those bands that I kind of assumed I would never get to see because I want to say they took a pretty long hiatus between 2011 and 2017, which doesn't sound that long now, but I think as of more recently, bands from the 2000s and early 2010s are more likely to tour versus 10 years ago. I think when somebody would say, "Hey, we're doing a farewell tour," it felt like they really meant it. Now that's not the case.
Well, maybe it's because millennials have more money now. They can finally go to the concerts that they never had the chance to before.
I wonder. I think so. Because I would have loved to have seen the Go Team at the time when they came out, but I was too young. Even though my parents were pretty chill about letting me see shows, I just don't know if they ever came around Philadelphia where I was living near at the time.
Yeah. And one more thing about the concert, Ninja was wearing a cheerleader outfit. Yeah, she
Yes.
had a crop top and then she was wearing a cheerleader skirt, which was both aesthetic but then highly functional. I mean, she wasn't doing flips, but pretty much everything else she was doing on stage.
I noticed that as well. And it was kind of like a nice tie to the theme of cheerleader rock because when doing research for this episode, I didn't really see a ton of references to the Go Team specifically talking about cheerleading, but seeing her wear that outfit felt like, hey, they're acknowledging that this is a huge part of their music. And it also talks into the function of like why cheerleaders wear what they wear, because it's great for aerobic activity.
Yeah. So that can conclude our thoughts on the Go Team. Now I want to get into Sleigh Bells next. So this is the other really big group that fits in with the cheerleader rock sound. Pretty much their entire discography matches what we're talking about with the cheerleader chants, blaring electric guitars, and then the marching band instrumentals. But their sound in particular really emphasizes the blaring electric guitars. The Go Team, it's more the marching band instrumentals. So that's one way you can differentiate the two with their very different sounds. Their music's really, really loud. Like oftentimes, I should have mentioned this in the beginning. I made a playlist. It's going to be the first thing in the show notes. It has many songs that fit into cheerleader rock. But the Sleigh Bell ones, I'm going to have to tone them down when I eventually play them, when I include them in the episode, because they are very ear splitting.
Yeah, you'll have to give hey, if you're wearing headphones, be careful.
Well, no, I'll tone it down. It'll
fair
be
enough.
okay.
You're just making me think though of when you watch YouTube videos and they're like, okay, if you're wearing headphones, be careful if they're like doing something that
Or like, don't crash your car or don't crash your bike.
right.
Yeah. But yeah, so Sleigh Bells, the band, who is it made up of? So they're a duo, which I think there are a lot of really good alternative duos at the time, like Crystal Castles, Purity Ring, Chairlift. Whenever I saw a male instrumentalist with a female vocalist at the time, I knew I was going to like it, pretty much guaranteed. And Sleigh Bells was no different. The way that the two members, Derek E. Miller and Alexis Krauss, found each other was Derek E. Miller was working at a restaurant at the time, and then Alexis Krauss was getting breakfast or lunch with her mom. And then the mom chatted up Derek and learned that Derek was looking for a female vocalist for a band he was trying to start, and then volunteered Alexis to go try out. And he'd actually been looking for the right vocalist for a really long time, around 4 years. And he'd tried out with like 20 or 30 different women. And he finally met Alexis, and then they had success pretty quickly after they started to collaborate. Their first album, Treats, it was released on Neat Recordings, which was MIA's short-lived record label, which I actually used to look at their website back in the day. I'd be like, what are they up to next? Because I liked Rai Rai, which was another album that MIA had signed to Neat Recordings, which also, it is neat, like NEET, like not in employment, education, or training, which does not seem very on brand for MIA. But yeah.
You are making me think though of like a previous way we used to find, or at least I used to find music as well, where I would go directly to record labels and see what artists they signed if I knew they had a tendency to sign artists I like. And I feel like that's such a relic of a past time. I don't know if maybe people still do it, but I certainly don't as much.
I think it's still good to try to get into the habit of doing things like that, because just consuming what the algorithm feeds you will lead you into dark places. If you go directly to the publishers or distributors, you can find out about things that you would never have heard about otherwise.
Well said.
But yeah, Sleigh Bells aesthetic. Okay, so the Go Team, it's sort of like 70s, 80s in this Urban Outfitters way. Sleigh Bells, it references cheerleaders and varsity aesthetics even less. They did it more so in the beginning. Like the album art for Treats, it has all of these cheerleaders with their faces and eyes crossed out. It looks a little bit satanic, which they're actually going for, because their aesthetic is more so just like rock star. They like wearing leather jackets or denim jackets along with really sleek sunglasses. And they have this look that was just always so cool.
Yeah, I when I think of Alexis, at the time when, Treats came out, she had those super thick black bangs, which were very reminiscent of, like, being a cool indie chick in 2010, and they were, to me, like, the epitome of cool, and I remember thinking that they seemed so old, but in retrospect, I think Alexis was 23 when the album first came out, which means she's, about to be 40 this year. So I'm like, wow, they were like kids when they released it.
Yeah. And she reminds me of this woman I once saw in a news article, I think from 2013, about like the most popular four people on OkCupid in New York City at the time. And the woman who was the heterosexual woman who was the most desired had these like sleek black bangs and just seemed like really cool. But Alexis is not as intimidating in real life, I think, as she aesthetically looks, because she was a school teacher. She has very loving parents. And then I've seen interviews with her and she just seems really nice. Like there's this one with where she's interviewed by children and she just seems like the nicest lady.
Yeah, reading about both members of the band, they seem like very conscientious and kind people, kind of similar to the Go Team. I think they both made an effort to make sure, not just, I mean, even though they're a duo, the whole entire production of their band wasn't just men, right? I think even reading about both members of the band, they seem just to be like really conscientious and kind people. I remember reading one interview where they were saying how the music industry is so male dominated and they really wanted to make a concerted effort to make sure their entire production, so crew, anybody playing a supporting instrument, merch, wasn't just men, but also included women, and that they were giving, everybody an equal fair shot. So I think it speaks in part to what you just mentioned, where, yeah, the aesthetics are maybe a little tough, but they themselves seem to be like quite kind people.
But they're always actually playing with this like harshness and softness. You can see it even in the beginning. And actually, their sound is sometimes credited as being the origin of hyperpop because Alexis's vocals have this really crisp, highly engineered sound that's then layered over really complex melodies that are a bit unpleasant, which was like sort of like some of the artists on PC Music back in the day. But I should play something now for the audience so that they can finally hear what Sleigh Bell sounds like. So this is Riot Rhythm. So Riot Rhythm is one of my favorite Sleigh Bells songs. It has the blaring guitars, it has like that harshness, but also it's not as extreme as some of their other songs like A&B Machines. Like there are some that like I have to shut up part of my brain to then be like, yeah, this is good. But, but no, their discography is great. Like Treats is one of the ones where you don't have to skip that many songs on the album. You can listen to half of it, no problem. But that's still so much better than most albums. I mean, most albums are only like one or two songs.
Yeah, I completely agree. I haven't listened. It was funny. Before we did this episode, I hadn't listened to Sleigh Bells in a really long time, but I have started going to the gym in the last few months. And so now I've been able to like add it to my gym music rotation, and it's been perfect for that.
Yeah, Sleigh Bells music, if you're listening to it, you kind of feel like the coolest person in the world.
Oh, completely agree. And what's nice is that I like, again, similar to the Go Team, where you're getting that loud sound and drowning guitar and reverb, but then with Alexis's vocals that sound really beautiful. Like, you can tell she's a really great singer. It's nice to have that option of music available for when you wanna be energized, but you're not angry. That doesn't always exist.
Yeah. So their first album, Treats, and had this cheerleader rock sound, but the most popular song off the album is this song called Real Real, which deviated a lot from the like sort of energy of the other songs on the album. It was their low-key chill song. That still to this day is their most played, and I feel like it's good. It's not one I actually want to listen to in my spare time, but I can really easily see why people like it. But I then think they took the cue from that song to then craft the sound of their sophomore album around it. So their second album, it was called Reign of Terror, and I got really hyped for it because there was a trailer that they released. I'll put a video link to that in the show notes. And they sampled a song that I thought was going to be on the album, wasn't even on the album. It came out later though. It's called Rainmaker. I do like that one. But to this day, I still feel disappointed because I think they then went away from the cheerleader rock basics into a more melodic direction.
Yeah, I'm with you. I remember being disappointed when the album came out, and it's funny when you read, the Wikipedia, it says, "Oh, it was met with acclaim," but I feel like I have a different memory where I felt like it was more mixed. Like, I
Hmm.
think half people really enjoyed it and half the people were disappointed. What I think is really interesting is that Real Real, while it is the least, cheerleader rock song on the album, and possibly why they went into that more melodic direction with their sophomore effort, it still has elements of cheerleader rock, most specifically because they sample from the funk band Funkadelic a song called Can You Get to That? And the Go team, as we mentioned before, also heavily uses samples. And I think that kind of adds into that like retro theme that fits into cheerleader rock as well. I personally love this song, but you're totally right that it's a completely different vibe. And I honestly think it's because of Real Real, they get associated with some other peers of that time who made more like melodic indie rock like
Yeah.
that, like Cults or Tennis or Best Coast.
Yeah, another reason I think they might have gone in the more melodic direction is I was listening to an interview with Derek Miller, and he'd said something about how he's getting older and it's just too loud. It's like he doesn't want to make music that hurts his ears as much anymore, which is honestly very fair. Although there is good news because they released a new song recently that I think is really good. It's called Wanna Start a Band. I'll play it now. And this song, it popped up on my like Discover Weekly playlist, and I immediately sent it to you because we'd been talking about maybe doing this episode since the Go Team concert in October. What was your first reaction to it?
I thought it was intriguing. I thought it sounded a lot more closer to their initial sound on Treats than anything I'd heard kind of previously. And so I'm stoked for it. It should be coming out a month from when we're recording this. So maybe by the time this is released or not soon, too far
Yeah.
after.
Wait, do you know the name of the album?
The album is called, it's going to be called Bunky Becky Birthday Boy. Yeah.
Yeah. You know what I learned from him is before he actually starts making the music, he likes to think about what the title of the album will be. So I wonder how or why he came up with that first. That's interesting.
Yeah, I'm not really sure what they're meaning with that. The aesthetic of the album appears to me like a gun with hearts on it
To
and
me,
wings.
their aesthetic they're going for at the moment, its reading is more not even hyperpop, but like the newer variety that's more like 100 gecs, like digicore. I feel like maybe they shouldn't go that way aesthetically, but musically, I think this is a great direction. I really do like their song, Wanna Start a Band.
Yeah, and what's interesting about the digipop, hyperpop connection that you made is they own it. They love when people say that they're the grandfather of that movement, and they only had positive things to say about 100 gecs. So it's totally possible that they're just going right along into that movement as well.
Yeah. And one more thing I want to say about Derek E. Miller, I think he's hot. I used to tell people in high school that he was my celebrity crush because, like, there's so many multitudes inside of him because he seems really shy and sensitive. He's always wearing sunglasses on stage and in pictures. And then he just seems really soft-spoken, but then he's really into making loud music, and I've always been intrigued.
I agree. I was looking at him after you said that he was hot, and I was like, "Oh yeah, totally." I think also something hot that I find about him is that he's letting Alexis kind of take the star, take the lead, being the vocalist, the hot female for the band. And to me, a guy who's confident enough to let a girl lead and take the star role, that's hot.
Yeah. And then you said you got to see them at Pitchfork in 2010.
I did, yes. I wish I remembered more. Unfortunately, I don't. I was 18 at the time, but I remember it was a ton of fun. For anybody who's been to Pitchfork Fest, they were playing at the Blue Stage, which is always my favorite stage because it's shady.
Yeah.
It's where the smaller sort of acts play. I say smaller, it's kind of a misnomer. Not the headliner, but always great acts. What was interesting though is I was reading about it, and they said that they had sound issues during that set, and so they were supposed to be like the loudest band at Pitchfork that year, and they ended up being like the quietest. So it was a bit of a struggle, but 18-year-old me, I didn't care, and it seemed fun.
If I were seeing them live, I would prefer if they toned it down a little bit because just the tracks themselves, they sound like they're exceeding the capability of the recording equipment. Like it's just too loud.
I know. I'm at that stage of life where like I wear earplugs as much as I can at shows. Think I've already messed up my hearing. And it's interesting because, when I was reading about the influences of Sleigh Bells and the Go Team, I think both bands at some point mentioned My Bloody Valentine and Sonic Youth. And those are rock bands from, Gen X era that were also known for like blaring guitars where you definitely want to wear earplugs for. So they for sure took that with Cheerleader rock.
Yeah. And the next artist I want to talk about is Gwen Stefani. So they only have one song that's Cheerleader rock, sort of similar to Toni Basil. But this one's really important because Hollaback Girl, I learned through the research that we did, it actually was the inspiration for Sleigh Bells. So we'll backtrack a little bit with this because I was thinking about Gwen Stefani and her discography and how it was so campy and playful and kind of bizarre. Like she had a track on her most famous album that was based off Fiddler on the Roof, and then another one based off of Alice in Wonderland, and then another one that's about her dying in an electric chair. Uh, it's like it was really all over the place. And so I was thinking about the role of pop stars and how it's sort of like with fashion houses, how they have to spit out so many collections that they kind of never get a cohesive aesthetic. There are other pop stars like Gwen Stefani, like I would say Katy Perry fits into this pretty well, where there kind of isn't anything cohesive about them that's carried with them. Even in one album, it just feels like it's this assemblage of a team coming together and being like, what if we made a song based around this really obscure feeling or idea? And that's kind of what happened with Hollaback Girl. But I wrote about how it's actually a good thing that pop stars do this because I then think that other people can come along, discover that creation, and then flesh out the idea. And that's literally what Derek Miller did with Sleigh Bells.
Yeah. I think something super interesting was when Derek Miller was talking about his influences. He mentioned Hollaback Girl and the song Lip Gloss, if anybody remembers that from the late 2000s.
Yeah, I think that's a really good song. It's not cheerleader rock because it's rap, but I think it's one of the few rap songs that make you think about being in high school, which is nice.
Yeah, and it has that very pop element, which I think it's interesting to see the cheerleader rock bands take and then make it rock. When that album, Gwen, I guess it was Love Angel Music Baby Lamb came out in 2004. I remember it was such like a big transition for Gwen. It felt like, even though No Doubt had always kind of flirted with being poppy, and they had a lot of success with their 1996 album Tragic Kingdom, they still kind of had that like rock cred, right?
Yeah, because I think of Gwen Stefani as being just a pop star. Because when I was coming of age, Britney Spears ended up being the queen of pop music from the 2000s, but when she was at her peak, it kind of felt like she was bigger than her. She was the biggest person around. And it wasn't until Guitar Hero that I learned that she had a previous musical career with No Doubt. I didn't even know she had any association with rock music.
Wow, and that must be like our generational divide. I'm what's considered a peak millennial according to the New York Times because I was born in 1991. But I think of Gwen Stefani as being the lead singer of ska band No Doubt. They were huge in the 90s. And then even before I would have ever known them, when they first started in Long Beach, California, they were like almost punk. And because of that like original punk ska sound that got more poppy as time went on, people had very strong opinions about No Doubt and Gwen Stefani, where some people loved her and then some people thought she was a sellout. And I think that bleeds into really well the inspiration of why Gwen Stefani made Hollaback Girl.
Yeah. And let's play it now so people can finally hear it.
This much. All the girls stomp your feet like this. Few times I've been around that track, so it's not just gonna happen like that. Cause it ain't no hollaback girl, ain't no hollaback girl. Few times I've been around that track, so it's not just gonna happen like that. Cause it ain't no hollaback girl, ain't no hollaback girl.
So I'm sure all of you have already heard this song, but now with the lens of cheerleader rock, you're noticing things. This song, it doesn't go as much in the rock direction. It's much more in the marching band instrumentals direction. But I think the chanting and the other elements, they really tie it together. And I think it makes perfect sense on this playlist. And one other thing to note with her is, I talked about how cheerleader rock really, it has three elements: the cheerleader chants, the blaring guitars, and then the marching band instrumentals. I think that two of them have already been done really well. Blaring guitars with Sleigh Bells and then the marching band instrumentals with the Go Team. The one corner, the third thing that I think a band, hopefully, or a musician one day will come around and do this really well and contribute to the cheerleader rock canon, they're going to be really great at the cheerleader chants part. Because I think the vocals for Sleigh Bells, they get drowned out a bit by the guitars. They're hard to hear. And then I think the Go Team, they're great. They're catchy, but you kind of can't hear what they're saying. Like, even I think Ninja said when we heard her perform live at Lincoln Hall that some of the lyrics, they don't know them. Like, they were samples and they don't know what they originally said. Like, it's hard to discern what they were saying. But I think Hollaback Girl, it has this catchiness in part because you can hear it so clearly. And I think both the success of Hollaback Girl and of Mickey being #1 songs, this can be very successful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that chant, BANANAS, that shit is bananas. Like, I have this vivid memory of being on a bus after a field hockey game and a group of, 12 to 14-year-old girls are just like screaming it. It was infectious.
Yeah. My brother used to tell me that she misspelled bananas, but that's totally not true.
I feel like I heard that rumor as well. And I don't know if this was just something that like older siblings were bullying us about.
They were planting false information.
Yes, exactly. But yeah, something that I think's really interesting is the reason why Gwen Stefani came up with this song. Apparently, it came from a comment that Courtney Love made about her, where she said, being in the music industry is being like in high school where I would be the burnout and Gwen Stefani would be the cheerleader. And I think she made another comment about that same trope where she's later, talked about Gwen Stefani being a cheerleader. I later learned that Courtney Love slept with Gwen Stefani's ex-husband. So
Wow.
I think that might have something to do with maybe the comment. And it could be Courtney Love projecting a little bit, but in a way, I'm glad she said it because it led to the inspiration of this song where Gwen Stefani was like, you want to call me the cheerleader? Fine, I'll be the cheerleader, and made the tune.
So it's like a cheerleader with attitude is the concept behind the song.
Exactly, yes.
But yeah, that whole album, though, I mean, it's just every song you're like, it almost feels like, what's that guy, Randy Newman? You know how every song on an album, it's like, why are you singing from this like really random and bizarre perspective, and it's not actually your own thoughts, but you're just singing like this? It's almost like Gwen Stefani was doing that, where it's like, why you're just a different person in every single song.
And I think that marked the transition of her becoming a pop star, because that often is the case in pop, right? It's not often coming from a place of like the artist's necessary experience when the song's being written. Often pop music's written by producers or other people, and it's kind of up to the singer
Yeah.
to take that on as a performer. And I think this was Gwen Stefani really stepping into that role.
Yeah, that's a good point. So now thinking about cheerleader rock, a lot of people will be familiar with the four musical acts we've talked about, but are there any newcomers to the subgenre? So I found one, Junior Varsity, is kind of the best fit. So they recently went in a new direction that feels very like cheerleader rock. They got a new vocalist, a girl, and they've released songs recently, like Cross the Street, and I'll play that now.
No, don't try to explain. I saw you on the train. On the train.
Cross the street, you stay a little, bite your tongue right in the middle. Cross the street, you stay a little, bite your tongue right in the middle. Come on.
So this has a really similar song structure to Huddle Formation. I can't exactly articulate why. I'm not like a musicologist. I don't know how to say it, but it feels like it's structured in the same way. And this song is actually really good. Like when I discovered it, I listened to it for a couple of weeks almost every day.
Yeah, I don't quote me on it. I should have probably done research on this before we recorded, but I think it might use the same time signature, and that's why.
Okay.
But I had the same initial thought where I was like, this really reminds me of Huddle Formation. But I'm with you. I also have been listening to it, and even if we weren't doing this episode and I happened to discover the song, I would have wanted to listen to it. Oh, I was listening to a few of their other songs, and they do kind of have slight elements of cheerleader rock within them. Her song New York is another one.
Yeah, I put that on the playlist. I do think that one fits really well.
Yeah.
And then their music video for My Star, it feels a bit like a Go Team music video.
Yeah, I would agree. Just with like the dancing.
It has that like 70s, 80s nostalgia that, I don't know, is Napoleon Dynamite the right way to say that? I feel like that's more 70s.
I think you could say 70s, early 80s.
Yeah.
Usually fashion kind of bleeds into like the first few years of a decade. They're not always so clean cut in the 10-year interval like we think.
Yeah. This band, it's pretty new. There's also another group with a somewhat similar name, the Junior Varsity. So we should clarify for people who listen to them because they're more famous. Junior Varsity is newer, hasn't been around for too long. I think it was originally just two guys, and then within the last year, they've added this female vocalist who I think is then turning it into cheerleader rock. I did find an article from Stereo Gum where it said Band to Watch, Junior Varsity, where the article said, when the trio first met at a cafe in Echo Park, brought together by a mutual friend, they instantly found a kinship through bands of what they call the early iPod era. We talked about MGMT and all the stuff we grew up on, which they didn't say the Go Team, but let's safely assume that, that they're an inspiration because I feel like they were definitely early iPod era.
Oh, absolutely. And even though we're talking about like the distinct genre of cheerleader rock, it is an offshoot of that indie rock with flirtations of electronic music that was so prevalent at that time, like Management, like, Chairlift. So it totally makes sense that they could take that inspiration and make the new generation of cheerleader rock.
Yeah. So now that we've surveyed cheerleader rock music, this was an idea I've had for a long time. I'm really glad I finally got a chance to do it. But what do you think after thinking about this? Do you think this is a genre? And then what do you think would happen if people started to recognize it as such?
Yeah. So when you first asked this question and I thought about it, I was a little bit, I think I was being too stuck in the mud. I liked the idea and I liked how you named cheerleader rock, but I think because there's not a ton of current artists doing it, at first my brain couldn't see it existing outside. But then, honestly, reading the interviews of the members of bands like Sleigh Bells, the Go Team, Gwen Stefani, my perception shifted, and I absolutely think it could be a genre. Mainly because, especially with the Go Team and Sleigh Bells, and I may have mentioned this earlier, but something that they had in common was that they were kind of genreless when they first came out. People were always really struggling to put them in a box. And I think that now that we finally maybe have a name to it, it's something that people can later draw upon and take inspiration from.
Yeah. I think the problem that Joseph and I usually find with music genres and subcultures and aesthetics where they get identified, there's a bunch of hype, and then they die down sort of as a consequence. When your band has been around for 20 or 15 years and you've had a successful career, it's only going to help at this point if someone finally draws the connections between all of these things and then classifies it. But I think part of the reason why we're now seeing cheerleader aesthetics reference without the rock music is largely because rock music has fallen to the wayside in the current music environment. Like, I looked up who won the Grammy this year for Best Rock Album, and it was the Rolling Stones. It's like all these grandpas. I'm not going to call it a dying art form. There are so many people who are into rock music, but most people, when they're approaching music and they're thinking about it through an aesthetic angle, they're not interpreting it through rock music as the default music genre anymore. That's part of why there are less bands coming to the forefront to sort of contribute to this legacy other than maybe Junior Varsity. But it's hard to say with them too. It's like, how long are they going to be doing it for? Is this, was Cross the Street just a one-off? Is this just the theme of their next album and they're going to discontinue that in the future? Who knows?
So you brought up a few points that I'm like, ooh, you got my brain thinking. First, when you were talking about you and Joseph, when you talk about genres and how they die off, like often the reason they die off is because it's the original idea and it gets distilled and redone, and it no longer feels fresh, but it feels like, oh, this is just the variation on the same theme and it's not making anything new.
Yeah.
And so I think because the bands we're talking about that have cheerleader rock have such fresh, unique sounds, it's not easy to necessarily repurpose and make it unless you have, I think, that artistry behind you. And I think that maybe as you mentioned, because rock music is not as popular, it might become more of a thing because people are more open to using things like electronic instruments and samples. I think something important to remember is that while rock has had a lot of like electronic elements with, new age, for example, there's always kind of been this tension in rock music with what instruments are considered rock and what aren't, right? Like in the 80s when new age came out, there was a huge debate whether if it should be even fall under the rock umbrella in the first place. And when the Go Team came out and Sleigh Bells came out in that like late 2000s era, people were still really stuck in their kind of like genres, right? Like if you listen to indie rock, it was like a certain type of indie rock and you rarely deviated. If you listened to pop punk, you listened to pop punk and that was your identity. Like people were so much more attached to like specific scenes and genres that to be a band that incorporates elements that are blaring guitars, but then pretty female vocals, it really, I think, changed things. And I think looking at it now through the lens of 2020, where people are much more likely to use samples to blend and mix different genres, to us, it doesn't seem so like unique or different. But I think for a long time it was. And I think as you mentioned with, rock music potentially dying, I think it's one of those things where it's a genre that constantly is shaping. You make me think of a book I read by Chuck Klosterman that came out in 2016 called What If We're Wrong? And the whole point of the book is trying to like figure out how we in the current state can look at what is being released in music and think what will later have acclaim. And he mentions that he thinks it'll be most likely electronic music. That's what we're looking at. And rock will become something where like jazz, where it's, of a yesteryear.
Well, there's even the School of Rock. Are you familiar with them? Not the movie, but there's like, they have this in Chicago, and I think it's like some sort of syndicated music program across the nation where like people with a fair amount of money, they'll pay to send their kid to the School of Rock to learn how to use a guitar. So like boomer dads will send their kids and then they'll get trained to play rock music in a somewhat classical way. It's interesting. But yeah, it's like something that people are now needing to encourage and be like, oh yeah, get into that instead of just playing on your synthesizer.
And I think, I don't think it'll ever completely die. I think there will always be people that have like an appreciation and fascination with those instruments. And I think it's totally possible too that because in this current era, we've actually seen a resurgence of cheerleader aesthetics in pop music with Chapel Rowan coming out with a song where she has a cheerleading chant. She wears a cheerleading outfit in the music video in Hot to Go. Olivia.
I do really, really think that fits. I would have maybe put it on the playlist if it wasn't just like one of the biggest songs of the last year. But I was like, it'll just feel a little out of place,
No, no worries. It's not cheerleader rock. It just has cheerleader aesthetics. I wouldn't consider it cheerleader rock either. But I think it's important to note it, as well as Charlie XCX's album Brat, which just came out this past summer. Like Olivia Rodrigo has also had cheerleading elements in her music. I think we're at this moment right now where people are really inspired by kind of this like bratty youth girl vibe. I think cheerleader aesthetics fit into that. But why I bring it up is that, like how Sleigh Bells and the Go team took influences from their youth or pop music going on at the time, I think it's totally possible that, maybe in 10 years, somebody who's a kid right now who grew up with those pop stars will repurpose that into something that is the 2030s version of cheerleader rock, which sounds so weird to say.
Yeah. I mean, my hope is that there are people who step up and focus on the cheerleader chant part as being the central element of their music. But it's also hard to then differentiate that from rap because it's honestly pretty close. I think the difference is that cheerleader chants are shorter and more repetitive. Like the song Hey Mickey, she says Mickey 100 times.
I know, you're completely right. And I think rap is meant to be something that's like poetic, lyrical, whereas a chant is meant to be more something, not to say it can't be lyrical or poetic, right? But it's like you said, it's meant to be short, get in your head, something that you can have rhythm to, right? There's usually like
bananas. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Speaking though, just real quick of the pop element, because I wanted to bring it up, and it was something where I think you ask about the genre and future of cheerleading rock and like what could have happened if it had gotten bigger was Beyonce.
Oh yes. Yeah, Sleigh Bells was supposed to do a collaboration with Beyonce. It's never been released. It's also never been leaked. But I've always been curious what that would sound like.
Yeah, me too. And I think it was in her 2012 performance at the Super Bowl where she had the marching band in kind of like those aesthetics. I wonder if that music had been released and came out, would we have seen the genre explode?
Seeing Sleigh Bells at the Super Bowl.
I know.
I feel like they were built for that. It would be like that SpongeBob episode where they go up to the Super Bowl, but instead it's Sleigh Bells.
Exactly. Well, maybe with this new album coming out, who knows?
Yeah. Because thinking about like, if this had been identified earlier or if there was a different trajectory for cheerleader rock, it's fun to think about them having the budgets for having like backup cheerleaders. I mean, I guess like pop stars, they have similar things. It's more in the marching band style, but it's cool to think about that aesthetically. Like, what would that have looked like? Do you see this sometimes though, like with the Go Team's live performances, like on Jimmy Kimmel, they had like dancers that they typically don't have when they're touring.
And what was interesting with thinking about the Go Team and like what could have been with their success is even though they've had a long career and they don't have any regrets, when they first came on the scene with Thunder Lightning Struck, they were big. Like they had headlining.
I even own their album. It was one of the first I ever bought.
Yeah, I think, and I remember they had like headlining sets, or if they weren't headliner, they were pretty high billing at like Glastonbury and Pitchfork.
Yeah.
And they said the problem was they only had that one album though, so they could only play for like, and it's a short album. I think it's like 30 minutes, maybe a little longer.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, because at the concert, they that we were at in October, they played the whole album, and then they had a little break, and it's like, okay, now we're gonna play other tunes to round it out. And I think they played like maybe 5 additional songs when
it felt like 10 more.
Yeah, it was a lot. Where normally when I've seen retro acts do an album, it's maybe like 3. But that's how short the album was. The reason why I bring it up is they said they might have just gotten a little too much press, like too much all at once, and it kind of maybe not that it died down because they as a band
Yeah.
continued, but I think it maybe stopped the momentum of like what could have been.
I mean, I don't want to make it seem like they weren't successful because I think they did really well. And I mean, they produced 7 albums, a ton of music videos, a ton of sales, I'm sure. But yeah, it's just, I think if this was taken in a more like pop direction in the Gwen Stefani route, like imagine a pop star where their whole album is, I mean, maybe people would get sick of it, but like if it was all bangers like Hollaback Girl, like I would love to see that and what like a concert like that would look like.
I'm sure it'd be amazing. And you're right. Like I don't want to
Yeah.
disagree. You're totally right that they've had like a wonderful career and they're doing great. I was reading an article with Ian, the mastermind behind the Go team, and I didn't realize this, but he was 30 when that album came out in 2004. And so he said because he wasn't really like a kid, he kind of understood that what was going on with all the press, and he knew not to like let it get to his head. And I think in the end that benefited them.
Yeah. Now we can kind of like, we might talk about cheerleader rock music a bit, but now we're going to round out the episode by just talking about cheerleading in general because I think it is such a potent cultural touch point. It's part of the reason why all these artists independently have reached out and used it for aesthetic inspiration. So we'll talk about cheerleader fashion first. So before doing this episode, I just thought this would be fun to throw in. But then I realized that pretty much all of these garments were things you could readily buy and wear during the mid 2000s and late 2000s, like the tops cheerleaders wear, even bodysuits, tank tops, crop tops. These were impractical in previous decades, but then around when American Apparel was big, which I kind of feel bad at this point every time I bring it up on the podcast because it's like my reference point for everything with clothing. But yeah, I mean, around when Thunder Lightning Strike dropped in 2004, you could go out and buy a bodysuit and you could make yourself look like a cheerleader if you got a crop top and a tennis skirt from American Apparel.
I would say don't feel bad. I think it's important to note that, again, before like the internet was what it is now, at least for me as a suburban kid outside Philadelphia, if I wanted to know fashion and dress cool, I basically had thrift stores, Urban Outfitters, and American Apparel. I didn't have the resources to go any high-end fashion. So I think it's okay to reference it because that's what it was. That was the brand that you emulated if you didn't want to be preppy or have a different aesthetic.
Did Urban Outfitters start in Philadelphia, by the way?
I don't know if it started in Philadelphia. I know it's headquarters there.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
Because I was there this last weekend and I got to see the Anthropologie flagship, which is really pretty. It's 4 stories. It has a stained glass dome and it looked great.
Oh yeah, it's gorgeous. You're so right though with the fashion of that time, like, and so much of it has continued to still be popular. But prior to I think the 2000s, like bodysuits, tank crop tops really were strictly just for like workout purposes, right? Like I always think of the 80s and like leg warmers, and I think in the 2000s they were taking that inspiration and then making it into fashion that's was wearable.
Yeah. This stuff, I mean, I can only say how it looks. I can't say how it feels or how it feels to do cheerleading routines in these garments.
I unfortunately can also not say how it does to do cheerleading routines in these garments, but from what I know about dance and working out, you do want things that you're not going to have to constantly tug at, falling down.
Yeah.
So I think they serve a purpose there.
Fun fact, I have one of my long lost brothers. He actually was a male cheerleader in high school. And I was reminded of that this Christmas because I saw him and he shows up and he's missing a tooth. And I'm like, what happened? And he's like, oh, it got knocked out when I was a cheerleader. I put it back in and the tooth finally died in my 30s.
That's hardcore. Be careful. They talk about all the CTE you get from football. Maybe you have to look at CTE from cheerleading.
Oh, yeah, no. Or we can talk about this a little early, but I wanted to talk about the risk of cheerleading because it is one of the most high-risk sports. Like traumatic injuries in cheerleading account for more traumatic injuries than all other sports for high schoolers. But there is one counterpoint, which is that the cheerleading is only the 9th most concussive sport. there are other sports you're more likely with football being the number one. But it made me think like concussion football player BF and then concussion cheerleader GF. I wonder why they're such happy couples.
I know. I should backtrack in the sense that I believe cheerleading is a sport. I didn't not mean to discredit that there is a legit physical risk in doing it. But oh my God, your comment makes me think of the show Daria, where there's two characters, Brittany, and then I forget the name of her boyfriend, but she's always in a cheerleading outfit and he's a football player, and they both probably have CTE based on the if you haven't seen Daria, great show. But and they're always but the thing is, what's nice about that show is they're not mean. They're very sweet characters. And Daria is always being kind of sarcastic, and it just completely goes over their head. And they go, wow, okay.
Yeah. So back to cheerleading fashion. So we talked about tops. In terms of bottoms, there are things like rah-rah skirts, pleated skirts, and A-line skirts. And rah-rah skirts, they have a great name. I think half of the appeal of them probably is just that it's a cool name, right?
Oh, yeah, totally.
Yeah. And I learned actually that it was the first successful revival of the miniskirt that had been introduced in the mid-1960s. Because prior to that, very short skirts, very short dresses, that was like a 1920s, 1910s flapper style.
Yeah. And I'm thinking, gosh, when I think about like mini skirts from the 80s and 90s, it tended to be like more straight and denim or leather. You didn't really have the girlishness of like the A-line cut that these skirts have, right? The rah-rah skirt, the pleated skirt, and the A-line skirt. I did have to Google what the rah-rah skirt looked like, but as soon as I saw it, I immediately was like, oh yes, this skirt. If you were like me, it is the iconic skirt you'll see on shows like Skins, Gossip Girl, in the movie Mean Girls. I think Lindsay Lohan wears one at one point. It has all these like little ruffles, and it's mini. But I didn't know that it was the first revival since the 60s. Makes a lot of sense. Whereas now I feel like mini skirts are so common, it's like a fashion staple.
Yeah.
I feel like I could talk a lot about these skirts too. Like, again, it makes me think of American Apparel. They were super big with their pleated skirt and their skater skirt, which is kind of cut in like this like billowy A-line way. But what the skater skirt, I think why it's so popular is that on a female body, it's incredibly flattering. I can say this as a female. It just, because it flounces out, it does so in a way that it tends to like hide the stomach or thighs if you are insecure about those areas. And it gives this like feminine cut that also can give the appearance of like a booty if you don't have one, or if you do, it's really going to accentuate it. And it'll show those legs. Whenever I think of those skirts, I think of like Tumblr fashion 2014, or just these skirts have since become very popular for like tailgating. When I Googled it, I saw a lot of pictures of like really pretty blonde sorority girls at USC wearing these like pleated skirts and A-line cut skirts that totally got their inspiration from the cheer aesthetic.
Yeah. And then bows are another big accessory of the cheerleader outfit. Now when I think of bows, I just think of JoJo Siwa and her wearing them as an adult and still thinking she's like a bad A-word now. But I think they've serve a functional purpose for cheerleaders. They help keep the hair down, which is actually very useful, because the alternative is them just like doing all of these acrobatic movements and their hair flipping around constantly, which I linked this in the notes we wrote. But did you watch the video about competitive disco dance competitions?
I didn't.
Oh, that's fine. But anyway, it's just this, it seems to happen in Balkan countries, doesn't really have that much of a relationship with disco. It seems to just be like Euro trash, Euro dance music. But they put extensions on that are meant to like bounce around as much as possible while they're doing all of these like pirouettes and stuff.
You know what, though? I think I've watched enough cheerleading shows that I think they do that as well. Like, I think sometimes the like Miss Piggy curls are fake that the cheerleaders have on their bows. Yeah, to give that like appearance. I know you're making me laugh with the JoJo Siwa thing, because I think bows also have had a moment with the coquette girl aesthetic that's been popular in the last few years. But I think it's important to distinguish that the cheerleading bow is quite big, right? And that I think is where the functionality of holding the hair comes down, and it gives that element of like femininity when you otherwise have to pull your hair up so it doesn't get in the way of your routine.
Yeah, like a cheerleading bow is typically cotton, is really big. The coquette style of bow, it's usually like ribbon. It's
Exactly.
satin or something.
Yes, exactly. It's more like delicate. But I think just in general, bows have kind of reached their like saturation point. But yeah,
Yeah.
I totally forgot that cheerleaders will utilize those like big curly curl extensions. And have you ever seen videos of the cheer girls getting ready for their routine? They're like spraying so much hairspray to just make sure it all sticks. It's crazy.
Yeah. No, I've never seen that. But whenever I see, sometimes I'll see this walking around downtown or like on a bus or a train, but I'll just see like a large group of young girls and their hair is pulled back really, really tight. And I'm like, okay, it's either a figure skating, a dance competition, a gymnastics competition, but you're in town for one of those, It's like this very particular look.
Are they all wearing matching clothes or?
No, they have like their jackets on, but you see their hair and you're like, you're going to something like that.
The only reason why I'm asking is I'm like, oh, are they trying to do the clean girl aesthetic? Are you familiar?
I am familiar, but
Okay.
no, they're younger.
Okay. Just
Yeah.
making sure. Yeah. You're probably right, though, that they're here for a competition. That makes so much sense.
Yeah. And then do you want to bring up sweaters?
Yeah. And so what's interesting, too, when you think of the cheerleader aesthetic is there's kind of like a cut point between 2000s and later aesthetics. And then I would say mid 90s and earlier, right?
Yes.
And so with that, traditionally, let's say in the like 60s, 70s, 80s, the cheerleader aesthetic was kind of like an offshoot of prep. And so often what the cheerleader would wear would be the iconic cheerleader skirt, as we discussed, but it would usually be paired with some kind of like sweater or like a varsity jacket. And it was much more like of a softer vibe.
Yeah, this is closer to the Seven Sisters style that we talked about a bit on the Ivy style episode. And the episode artwork we're going to use for this week, it really fits this look. It's from Syracuse University, I believe, in the 50s or the 60s. And the woman in it, she has this sweater and a really long skirt. And the pom-poms look like they were handmade instead of manufactured in China. But that look, I think, is equally iconic. But yeah, it's more tied into preppy fashion than it is athletics. Although Ivy style, as we talked about in the episode, that also is derivative of sports. But that's a complex history.
Just as a quick aside, my grandmother went to Syracuse University, and I don't know if she was a cheerleader there, but she was a cheerleader in high school.
Oh, cool.
So that's like a funny little synchronicity. But yeah, you're totally right on the point where it was while inspired by varsity sports, it didn't have the same kind of like functionality that I think modern aesthetics of cheerleading uniforms have.
Yeah, and then the final garment we can talk about is pom-pom. So this is the most iconic, and it's always typically associated with cheerleading. But I went to a high school where there was a cheer team and a poms team. So a lot of the activities you associate with cheerleaders were sort of divvied up, where the cheer team, they did the cheering and then they did the acrobatics. The pom teams, they had the poms and the music and the dancing. Although maybe the cheer team also had music during their competitions, I'm not too sure. But there was a definite difference between the girls that gravitated towards one team versus the other. I don't fully know how to articulate this, but the girls that were like, I need to be a cheerleader in high school, something was off. I think the girls on Poms had a better time, and there was just something usually up with the girls that were like, I need to be a cheerleader.
Yeah, when we were first talking about doing this episode and you mentioned Poms, I had to ask because I didn't know. At my high school, it was just one cheerleading team. It was a small school though. And it's funny though, because it wasn't really like what the quote unquote popular girls wanted to do. It was more just girls who I think really wanted to be a cheerleader. But it is interesting though, talking about like the fashion element of it, because I think as the sport changed, so did the aesthetics and the fashion. Like as we were talking about just earlier with the more preppy style, I think that was when cheerleading functioned more as being the supportive role at like basketball and football games. You would chant and maybe do a little dance. But then once as the sport became more like an offshoot of gymnastics, that's when you needed the bodysuits to be able to do those moves. And yeah, it's funny to me to think like the difference between the two. And remind me again, which one was more of the dance and which one was more just like the cheering?
Pom is more dance.
Got it.
And then cheer is more acrobatic and cheering.
That makes sense.
But I feel like it's probably safer to split up all of those activities because, it's hard to to remember lyrics and do flips at the same time as it is. So reducing the number of things you have to do at once is probably helpful. But definitely on the professional level still, all of these things we associate with cheerleading are still the same sport. Like if you see the cheerleaders for professional sports teams, which I haven't because I'm not into sports, but I assume they're doing all of these things. They're not like, oh, that's for Poms. No, they're doing all of it.
I think yes and no. Like I did go to a basketball game and I saw the Utah Jazz versus the Lakers, and they had cheerleaders and they did some flips, but it wasn't like some of the more intensive stuff I've seen at like
Yeah.
competitions. There's a show on Netflix that came out maybe like 4 years ago called Cheer, and I remember actually they talked about when they kind of like didn't love having to do like the basketball games. It was more like, okay, we're viewing this almost as like a live practice, and it felt like a thing they had to do, but more of what they were into were the actual like competitions. And those, yeah, you're not really cheering that much. I think it's more about like the dance and the flips.
Yeah. And on cheerleading TV shows, now we can segue into talking about cheerleader movies. So I watched Bring It On a bit for this week. Do you want to start with that?
Yeah, sure. So as mentioned before, like I was, I think 8 or 9 when Bring It On came out. And it was, I think, hugely influential to like millennial girls and women. I think Kirsten Dunst is just somebody who's so charming, and I think that she is a huge draw, but it really changed the way cheerleading was depicted in media. Like before that, usually cheerleaders were an auxiliary kind of character that existed to be ogled at by like the men in the movie, to be the mean popular girl. Or in a horror film, she was either going to be killed if she wasn't a virgin, or maybe the final girl if she was. But they weren't really made to be dimensional, right? I think the only example is technically Buffy the Vampire Slayer was a cheerleader, but like they rarely touched on that.
That show is about vampires, not cheerleaders.
Exactly. Whereas Bring It On was like really focused about like cheerleading as a sport. And a lot of the characters in the film are smart and they're funny and they're people and they're not just mean. And it was kind of nice to see that explored. I think also what makes Bring It On so iconic is it also shows cheerleaders as not just like the pretty preppy white girl. They show the rival squad, which is, I think they're from East Compton.
Yes,
and they're
the Compton Celtics.
Yes, and they're all black and they're great and they have a rivalry. And then they also show, straight and gay male cheerleaders, and you just didn't see cheer depicted in that way on TV. And so even though I was never a cheerleader, I think just as a young girl, it really appealed to me. I will say as an aside, I watched it during the pandemic with my ex and our roommate at the time. And I remember the roommate and I were like loving it. But then there were a couple scenes where like, oh, they must have edited that out for TV. So I should give that like warning.
Yeah. I mean, the humor kind of reminds me of scary movie humor where it's not very PC. It's also like there's a certain naivete that I think is harder to see in today's world. You can access criticism so much online. You can't just be so carefree or appear that way. But I liked the movie. I thought that the cast, though, they're totally guilty of that thing that a lot of movies about teenagers do, where the cast is clearly all like mid-20s. They look like full-grown adults. They do not look like they're seniors in high school.
I was seeing, I think it was one of those like YouTube interviews where they asked actors to look back at roles, and it was one with Kirsten Dunst, and she was saying that she was literally like the only teenager. I think she was 18 when it was filmed, and she was saying like, yeah, because of that, like I got along with the cast, but she was like, they were all going out and like partying at bars, and I was like home with my mom, like finishing high school. So you're completely right. They're all like, Gabrielle Union, I think, is 29 or 30. She's ageless, but the fact that she was still playing a teenager is crazy.
Yeah.
And I should say, like, it is definitely that era of like late 90s, early 2000s, like teen film humor. So,
I like the spirit of that, though.
Yeah.
It's not even about like the humor. It's just like, I don't know. There's just this lack of like criticality that I find refreshing.
I agree. And I think it's really indicative of like a pre 9/11 time where things felt more optimistic and hopeful. And you're right that like there wasn't the way of like criticism that we have access to now. So you could just make a
Yeah.
film that just felt like the purpose of
You could
this
just
is
be a
to be fun.
cheerleader and have fun.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I do need to finish that still. But yeah, I didn't get the chance to check out any other cheerleader movies or films, but are there any others you'd like to bring up?
Yeah, I would love to shout out the 1999 cult classic, But I'm a Cheerleader with Natasha Lyonne. Clea Duvall is also in it, if anybody knows her. RuPaul has a little cameo. Melanie Linsky, who's now in Super Jackets. Natasha Lyonne plays a character who gets accused of being a lesbian and sent to a gay conversion camp, and hijinks ensue. Hijinks ensue, right? But it's just like a really fun movie. It's very campy. It has like a sweetheart at the end. But I think I saw it kind of young just because I had older siblings and cousins and my parents didn't pay attention to what I watched. But I remember at the time, like, I don't think I quite got it, but I liked it. I was like, oh, these all seem like nice people.
Yeah. Fun fact on gay conversion therapy camps. I was told once that more or less there's kind of only ever been one for lesbians because families freak out more if their sons are gay typically for graphic reasons I won't go into. But yeah.
Yeah, I know. I'm like, not to like make light of like, oh, this cute movie about gay conversion camp, but they are making
Yeah.
fun of it and kind of showing the
Yeah.
ridiculousness of it. And
I do think,
Yeah.
gay movies before the era of LGBT acceptance do hit harder. And plot lines about like forbidden love just feel more romantic,
Absolutely. And I think too, where the film is kind of good is that at least what I can envision is one of the few depictions I've seen of like lesbians not being a certain specific trope. Like I always think of in the 90s when they would highlight like a lesbian character, it was usually somebody butch or like really crunchy granola. And Natasha Lyonne's character's preppy. She's a cheerleader. She loves her girls. She doesn't recognize that she's queer until later on in the movie. And I know there's a lot of like theory about compet. We don't have to totally go into it because I'll admit I haven't read all of it, but I think people cite that as like one of the first times in, film where that kind of topic is explored.
Yeah. I've never seen it. I should see it one day because honestly, when I watch gay movies, I want to watch them with men. I don't think I've ever really watched a lesbian film. But one day I will.
I'm resisting. I'm like, that's why you're a bad ally. No, I'm kidding. You can edit that out.
Yeah.
I think other than that, the only other kind of like cheerleading things that would highlight, there was a 2001 movie I saw called Sugar and Spice with cheerleaders performing a heist. That's sort of interesting with a young Mina Suvari and James Marsden. Have not watched it probably in over 20 years, so I can't tell you if it's good or not. And then Jennifer's Body, 2009 film with Megan Fox. There's not like a ton of cheerleading in it, but there's an iconic scene with her dancing and Amanda Seyfried's character is kind of like in awe. And that also is a film that kind of has like queer undertones, is often discussed. But yeah, beyond that, like I think in recent media and film, I can't think if there's been a ton with cheerleaders kind of portrayed in the way that I think these films did. I think now as a culture, we've almost sort of moved away from like the mean cheerleader trope. Not to say that that character doesn't exist, but I think we don't assume all cheerleaders are mean and stuck up like I think people did in like the 80s and 90s and even 2000s. And it's kind of interesting to see these labels morph and change over time.
Yeah, I just think we as a culture have moved away from the cheerleader being the icon of the hottest girl in school. I don't think people really like the idea of there being like one standard of beauty. We've moved away from that, and that's part of the reason why.
I know I'm like the hottest girl in school now is like a TikTok baddie or she's like a mild like influencer. It's all about like how she can market and sell her brand, not about, being within the confines of school.
Yeah, she's trying to impress strangers online, not the teenage boys in her class.
Exactly. I do have a really important question for you, Nathan.
Yeah.
Did you ever want to be a cheerleader?
No, I don't dance at all, actually. I never have really been able to.
Me neither. Respect to it, but yeah, it wasn't something as a kid that I was like, "Ooh, I want to do this."
Yeah. There are definitely a lot of like gay cheerleaders out there. I mean, I'm sure everyone's like, duh. But I've talked to a few. Yeah, they're usually able to do flips and somewhat ripped.
Yeah. Makes sense. I never did dance because I think my mom thought if I did dance, I would develop body image issues, which, sorry, mom, did anyways. So I also can't dance, and maybe that's why I did not want to be a cheerleader.
Yeah. Well, thank you for doing this episode with me, Christine. You have been a great Discord contributor, and this episode went even better than I could have hoped for. I think people are going to walk away listening to cheerleader rock music, hopefully.
So yeah, thanks for having me on, Nathan. I really appreciate it. This was so much fun. And if anybody has any questions about music or cheerleading aesthetics, let me know.
Yeah,
I'm in
you
the
can hit
Discord.
us up on Discord.
See money.
See you. Bye.